And we are live. Wow. Amazing. Believe we are live. Welcome, everyone, to the return of the Saturday stream. The Saturday stream Straussian, even. Welcome, everyone. We have a lot to talk about today. The topic of today's stream, actually, before we get to that, I should share the link, because people don't know that I'm going live. This is the kind of pre-show. We're 4 minutes before going live, and I'm going to go ahead and share that link now. If you are listening, you should also share the link, because there's a lot to talk about today. Okay, live now. And the big thing to talk about today is the liberal political theory. It says so right on the screen capture. You can see it. What is the liberal political theory? I think that until recently, there was a very clear answer. And now it's no longer so clear. And that's because of all of the changes that have happened, the reckoning with what the conservative political theory or the reactionary political theory has become, and, quite frankly, the backing away from the historical left-wing political theory. First of all, what do I mean by political theory? I specifically mean a sort of power analysis or political analysis, an understanding of how power flows, a kind of org chart for the government, but not just for the government, but for the kind of extended government, the things that decide an election, the things that decide the economy, the things that decide how everything works. The reactionary political theory, for example, is very easy to define. It comes from, very old thinkers like Machiavelli, leading up to more modern thinkers like Curtis Yarvin, and they have a very clear argument about how power works. If you want to get things done, where do I, kind of put my chips? Where do I try to create change? Where do I try to, create a regime change? Curtis will always say, you want to focus on the New York Times, you want to focus on the organs of media consensus. That flows downstream and affects, it affects the elections, it affects the permanent bureaucracy, so on and so forth. I can't go into all of it now. I can literally go on for hours about this. I have a podcast with Curtis where we discuss this and, my disagreements with him. But that's the reactionary political theory. Now, the old liberal political theory is also really easy to define. The old liberal political theory, there's a whole lineage of that as well, stemming from Marx, and then later emerging in its full force with Michel Foucault, famously postmodernism. And that political theory was that you essentially had what Foucault called biopolitical control, but you had this whole system of mass manipulation, targeting this merger of capitalism and a kind of, emerging totalitarian state. And when you hear me say all of this, you might be thinking, this Foucault guy, he sounds like he could be wearing like a Maha hat, like a Make America Healthy Again hat, signing up to vote for Kennedy. And part of that is because of how things have changed. I think that one of the reasons why the left doesn't really have a solid political theory now is that their old political theory got completely adopted by the right. We are in total Michel Foucault victory. The entire thing with Doge, the entire thing with the kind of Truth and Reconciliation campaign for COVID, all of this is like a total Michel Foucault victory. But it's not a victory for the left, because the people who are actually doing and exposing and kind of enacting almost the kind of Foucauldian mission of deconstructing all of these methods of manipulation, all those people are on the right now. Kennedy supported Trump. He endorsed Trump. And so you've had a two-step thing where the right wing or the reactionary political theory has really become ascendant and has also co-opted aspects of the historical left wing and postmodernist political theory. Now, I think I wouldn't go as far to say as to say Foucault is now a right winger or a reactionary. I don't think that's true. But what is definitely true is that the establishment left, the Democratic Party, they are no longer signed up to Foucault's description of power. They would not agree with it, they would reject it, and I think they themselves would recognize it as a kind of conservative, reactionary, populist way of thinking. They would associate it with Kennedy. I'm not sure, like Foucault is very well known in academia, like literally the most cited philosopher, I believe. Or maybe just most cited modern philosopher, but still very, very impressive. I am not sure if you hear a kind of very classic statement of biopolitics, if the median Democratic representative would recognize that as coming from Foucault as opposed to coming from someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. All this is to say that the old left-wing political theory is over. It is no longer something that is embraced by the left. So what's next? What's happening? The two people I've named as leading the development of a new left-wing political theory are Ezra Klein and Francis Fukuyama. Of course, Francis Fukuyama has been thinking about philosophy and writing about philosophy for a long time, but I think that his ideas are ascendant within the kind of new resistance. So people are thinking more about Fukuyama, people within the Democratic Party are thinking more about Fukuyama, and Ezra Klein is someone who's really come into his own and is really, taking these questions seriously nowadays, especially in the past year. First with the entire scenario with Biden, where, many would say that he played an early and an important role in getting Biden out, and then later with the kind of post-Trump aftermath. How he's thinking about this, and how he's thinking about this reevaluation. That's not the first name I have on this list. The first name that I have on this list is Crystal Ball, who is the co-host of Breaking Points. So the whole deal with Breaking Points is that they have a left-wing and a right-wing co-host. The right-wing co-host, Sagar and Jetty, he's been on the podcast. We had a great episode. And the thing with sorry, we just had a bit of a disturbance. But the thing with Crystal Ball is that she has a reaction. She is now kind of writing news monologues, essentially, about the theories of Mark Andreessen and of Curtis Yarvin, in a way that seems very familiar to me. And the reason it seems very familiar to me is that she's kind of taking these ideas and inverting them and complaining about them in the same way that someone like James Lindsay or Jordan Peterson complains about post-liberalism. That's sort of what's happening here. Not post-liberalism, postmodernism. The same way, so Crystal Ball complains about Curtis Yarvin and the reactionaries in the same way that, someone like James Lindsay complains about postmodernism. And this is really interesting because you're in this situation where for many, many decades, you had the right on the back foot in terms of political theory, and they're reacting to these academic ideas, and they're reacting in, very, very aggressive ways. And now that's beginning to change. Now that's beginning to invert and create this sort of prototypical left-wing political theory, which is basically just saying, like, okay, the right-wing political theory, all of the things that the right-wing political theory describes as happening is correct, except, instead of saying it's good, it's bad. And that's sort of the role of a Jordan Peterson or of That's sort of the role of a Jordan Peterson or of a kind of James Lindsay type. And it did lead to something more, right? Yarvin was working concurrently. Andreessen, I think, was still a Democrat, but more people were thinking concurrently, and I think like Lindsay and certainly Peterson had a role in the realignment. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But what I think this really shows is that the dynamic has inverted in very important ways. Kind of have everything out of order right now. Where is okay? I have the order correct here. Oh, I wanted to do the second one first. Fukuyama is very interesting. He is most known, of course, for The End of History, The End of History and the Last Man. So he wrote this book called The End of History and the Last Man, and he's best known for this concept of the end of history. The idea that we've just settled on liberal democracy, that this is the final form of the regime, that we're not getting any more, great power history, capital H history anymore. We're just done. And his ideas about the last man are also quite interesting. Of course, a term that's borrowed from Nietzsche, and his interpretation, stems heavily from Kojève, who is an interpreter of Hegel. So the philosophy with Fukuyama, the philosophy goes very deep. And what's very interesting about Fukuyama in the present day, with his more modern books, is that he's really become the flag bearer, at least in my opinion, the flag bearer of this concept called the democracy of institutions. And the democracy of institutions, I think it's a term that's coined by Jacob Siegel, although I've also heard Mike Benz popularize it very often. But the democracy of institutions is this idea that in order to have a kind of full liberal democracy, you have to have power flowing through all of these mediating institutions, right? So both in terms of shaping public opinion and parsing public opinion. So, people will have these sentiments, and they're kind of unruly and chaotic sentiments, and you need education and news media and so on to kind of control public opinion and to shape it into something that can be more productive. And then that goes into that kind of modified public opinion, then goes into creating elections, and the elections elect the elected officials, who then go through another layer of mediating institutions, the bureaucracy, the NGOs, in order to actually enact law. So you have all of these ways in which more and more middlemen are added to the pile. And you'll notice, actually, that this shares a lot in common with Curtis Yarvin. I am honestly not that... I really want to... Actually, Curtis listens to me sometimes. He's been on the podcast. I don't know if old Frank listens to the podcast at all. But I would love to have Francis Fukuyama and Curtis Yarvin sit down and talk about, in terms of pure, amoral descriptions of how things work. Not in terms of what's good or bad, but just how things happen. What do Francis Fukuyama and Curtis Yarvin actually disagree on? Because what's been really fascinating to watch with Doge and the new opposition is that they identify. They're either, drawing on Curtis directly. He was in the New York Times. Or kind of just independently discovering the same thing. They kind of recreated Curtis's description of, the cathedral, of this network of academia and journalism and all of these kind of mediating bureaucracies. They come up with the same org chart, only they think it's good and Curtis thinks it's bad. And so this is one inroad to the liberal political theory, right? One inroad to the liberal political theory is that you're just thinking of it as the conservative political theory, but in reverse. And I think that so long as that's the liberal political theory, they're going to continue losing. because that's something where I think just in terms of the populace, they're incredibly suspicious of middlemen. This is actually something that Ezra Klein identifies as well. But both in terms of the middlemen being, something that the public is suspicious of, but something that creates actual problems as well. We'll talk about that later when we get to Ezra Klein. But just staying on Fukuyama, he has, I think his philosophy as a whole really ties together, right? You have the end of history, you have this end of geopolitical conflict and regime change, and the end of capital H history. You have the adoption of all of these intermediating institutions, right, to create this really kludgy, over-optimized, over-engineered democracy where public opinion is over-engineered, and the way that the executive can actually exert power. The way that that's mediated by all of these institutions, that's over-engineered. And this entire system is, over-engineered, and it's good that it's over-engineered because actually we're at the end of history. Because actually the only thing that you could be up to is to add additional cycles to this kind of big computational process. There's no point in asking philosophical questions. Maybe you can ask them, sure, and you can debate, and I've watched plenty of Francis Fukuyama panels. They're very interesting as a kind of philosophical matter, but in terms of real stakes of how the governments work, don't even think about that. And I have this just written here, John Stuart Mill and education. I don't know how much I want to talk about that. People have heard my speech about how John Stuart Mill was the Judas of classical liberalism, and how his focus on human perfectibility made actual classical liberalism impossible. That's the summary. That's the summary. I'm not a fan. But in many ways, that's part of the mediating institution ideology as well. Because the mediating institutions, what do? They educate the public opinion, they shape the public opinion, they direct the public opinion, they take the public opinion and turn it into this more kind of peaceable, to go back to The Last Man, this isothymic, non-aggressive, feminized, passive form, to put it in terms that, I think Fukuyama would endorse, to put it in a more calm, a more peaceful form, and for that to be the thing that actually shapes elections. And of course, going direct and, populism and actually speaking directly to voters through these, without going through these mediating institutions, that's a huge threat. It's a huge threat to democracy. It's a huge threat to the democracy of institutions. And why is it a huge threat to the democracy of institutions? Because, obviously because it bypasses the institutions, but why is that a problem for them? Because they're actually deeply skeptical of human nature and deeply skeptical of what voters will do if left unchecked. That is, I think, a fundamental principle of the new liberal political theory. That voters, left unchecked, without mediating institutions, are a danger, are a threat. The voters are a threat to democracy. That is what they believe, and that is what, this is, constantly talked about in New York Times editorials and Washington Post. Democracy dies in darkness. This is what is meant by, our democracy. I'm gonna sip some tea here. You people think I'm joking. I have literal tea. If you're enjoying this, of course, you should share with more people. You should help more people join the stream. I really don't have a YouTube audience. I just got 100 followers. And that's less than, around 1/100th or around 1/50th of the stream or of the podcast followers. So there's still a lot of moving going on. And what a lot of people told me actually is that the YouTube audience is completely different. they like the video, for example, right? They want to watch me like wave my hands in the air and freak out about liberal political theory. Well, I don't know if that matters. So let's actually read what Fukuyama is actually saying, because I've like described Fukuyama to you, but I think I would think faithfully. But let's actually read what Fukuyama is saying a month ago. And this is like, wow, these Substacks, these like resistance Substacks, they're going crazy. Those are amazing numbers. This is already a very strong claim, right? When historians 50 or 100 years ago from now investigate how and why Western civilization collapsed, they would point to Silvio Berlusconi as the chief villain. The former Italian prime minister was the inventor of the modern form of oligarchy, in which a rich individual uses his money to buy his way into political office through the purchase of media properties, and then uses his political office to protect his business interests. So here you already have a kind of pre-Trump, right? And many people argue this. Fukuyama has argued this for sure. That Silvio Berlusconi is the kind of pre-Trump. He is the Italian populist. He is this very charismatic, personality cult type figure, and that's the predecessor to Trump. But not only is he the predecessor to Trump, Fukuyama argues, he's the predecessor to Elon Musk. Musk's purchase of Twitter for $44 billion was derided as a bad business decision. But as in the case of Berlusconi and his ex-communist oligarchs, Musk wasn't purchasing the platform for economic reasons, nor was he interested in defending free speech as he suggested. Of course, this is the liberal political theory framing, so you have to, you have to. I would like a liberal writer to start writing in the style of Machiavelli, and just be like very clear pill, just be very objective. But of course, it's a liberal political theory. You're going to get some liberal moral assertions. So, just bear with me. Rather, he wanted to buy political influence, which he did in spades. That I think is, undeniable. Even if you think that he bought political influence by defending free speech, he still bought political influence. X turned from being a slightly left of center platform. That's okay. That's just not fair. They were promoting, transgender beliefs that like banning people for not adhering to transgender beliefs that like poll less than 20% of the country. But okay. To becoming a MAGA megaphone, which Musk uses many times a day to broadcast his own political opinions. That plus $250 million to the Trump campaign did a lot to help Trump get elected, and Trump has now given him political roles as co-head of Doge and an all-purpose advisor. So you're setting this up where the kind of direct, efficient communication is a threat to democracy, right? Both direct communication to people, right? Trump to the public through Twitter, right? I guess you're still a little bit indirect, but you're certainly a lot more direct than going through media interviews. And also the direct translation of money into influence. There's a big problem in political economy called the Tulloch rectangle. Most famously put in a paper called Where is the Rectangle? And the reason why the paper is called Where is the Rectangle is that political markets are not efficient. If you assume that, people act in rational ways, and especially large firms act in rational ways, and that they're going to see a political opportunity to, get an advantage, and they can pay some politicians to get the advantage that increases their profit, then they'll do it. But that doesn't quite happen, at least not fully. So where is the rectangle is asking, why doesn't it happen more? Why isn't there more political corruption? And that's a big unsolved problem. We actually don't know the answer to that. I'm fascinated by this question. But Fukuyama is taking a different look at this question, and Fukuyama basically says, okay, it's good that it's inefficient. And I think many people would agree. Quite frankly, I think, a lot of the people, just a lot of like average Americans, if you say like, do you want it to be easier or harder? You want to be more direct or more indirect to for money to translate into power. They would say, they want it to be harder. They want it to be, I don't know if they would say more indirect, but they would definitely want it to be harder. And we can get into the nuances there. Like, the nuance is basically that, like, okay, is the indirect form of corruption, is that actually less corrupt, right? Maybe the numbers aren't there, but in many ways it's creating a kind of permanent constituency that itself is corrupt and itself is funded by, these kind of big money interests. That's something that, like, the Maha people would say. And it's also something that Foucault would say, right? Foucault would have a much more sophisticated critique of this entire network of mediating institutions, and would basically say that this entire kind of consensus-creating apparatus is itself a merger of states and kind of neoliberal corporate power. But we're getting a little bit distant. You can already see, right? But this is important, I think. You can already see the tensions between a kind of Foucauldian perspective and a kind of Fukuyama perspective. Consider the long-term implications here of Musk buying Twitter. Social media is rapidly displacing legacy media as the primary way Americans get information. No one should pretend that they are neutral town squares. Rather, they are political actors that can influence the outcome of elections. This is very interesting, because this is what people were saying about, YouTube and Facebook in, like, 2016 and in 2020. They were censoring the Hunter Biden laptop. They were not neutral town squares. And you really needed to bring the, like, conservative crackdown. We'll see how that goes. We'll see how the conservative crackdown goes. The real problem is that they are too big and powerful. So were the three over-the-air TV networks in their heyday. But their political influence was checked by the FCC and old-fashioned norms about media neutrality. No such constraints exist today for the large platform in online space. So you're already seeing the dynamics that I talked about, right? You want to make the system more bureaucratic. You have more mediating institutions. You want to just shove them all in there. You want more things that get between, the efficiency of communication. You want more things that kind of add layers, add epicycles, right? And like the FCC, like the old-fashioned norms about media neutrality, that's what they did. And that once again gets to the question of, like, okay, let's say we sat down Fukuyama and Curtis at a table, maybe this table. That would be really fun, flying them both in, sitting them down at this table. And we asked them, like, okay, moral terms aside, in terms of pure, descriptive, objective terms of how power works, do you guys actually disagree on anything? Because this is something that, if you take, like, too big and powerful, if you take all of the connotations and just reverse them, right? If you took every instance of here's what's happening and it's bad and replaced with here's what's happening and it's good, would you really see that much of a difference between Fukuyama and Curtis? That power needs to be diminished, Fukuyama continues, and the only feasible way I see that is to do the proliferation of middleware that would take away their editorial power. The middleware idea was the subject of a study group I led at Stanford in 2020, a new report for FAI. Okay. We said that large internet platforms were like a loaded gun sitting on a table in front of us, and that we only hope no bad actor would pick it up and shoot us with it. This is very funny. This is hilarious, right? Because it's a kind of selective blindness. This is an amazing selective blindness, because, people were just taking the social media platforms and unloading them into the Hunter Biden laptop and the New York Post, and all of these right-wing stories like an AK-47. Like, there is definitely a degree of political influence that Musk is asserting on Twitter. Like, that is undeniable. You look at, like, he banned Ken Klippenstein for a while, for example. I think he's been unbanned now. There are definitely examples of Musk putting his finger on the platform. Quite frankly, that pales in comparison to what happened in 2020. I think just as an objective, like, quantitative measure of like just the total number of bans, right? I think Musk famously banned like 2 people. It was Ken Klippenstein. It was like someone else who was like releasing, um, like under the excuse of like some other private information. How many people did 2020 era Twitter or 2016 era Twitter ban like just based on content, just based on the political opinion expressed? In purely quantitative terms, it's much less than Elon has banned. I hope you enjoyed this very intense dose of the liberal political theory. That is, I think this is the quintessential restatement of the liberal political theory. Once again, I wish that someone would come around and put it in more kind of objective, analytic terms. But if you take away from your takeaway from this, it's not purely reactive. Like Fukuyama has been doing this for decades. Fukuyama kind of believed in the current liberal political theory even when it was challenged. Like what is the liberal political theory now? What we just talked about, right? That mediating institutions were good. He believed in that, against Foucault, against the postmodernists, for many decades before it was a kind of when it was being opposed by the left instead of being opposed by the right. So he has believed in this idea. He's been consistent for many decades. But I think the way you should read this is that, Fukuyama's political theory is now becoming the dominant, or has become the dominant political theory of the left. And that is basically, if you're coming from a right-wing perspective, it's basically, Curtis Yarvin, but the yes and no's are reversed. The good and bad is reversed. You want the mediating institutions. You want to build the cathedral. The cathedral is moral and good, and that you want, democracy dies in darkness. You want as many mediating institutions as possible. You can't have unfiltered public opinion. You can't have direct communication. You can't have direct translation of money into press or money into power, or press into power. You can't have populism. Democracy has to beat populism. Democracy has to beat the voters. So we can go into the second article. It relates to the writing of Jennifer Polka, who is a very interesting sort of left-wing reformer. Basically, she worked on the OG Doge, the U.S. Digital Service, or advised it at least. I don't know if she officially worked in that department, but was instrumental in setting it up and making sure it worked. She writes about this in a great book called Recoding America, and I've written about that book and about Polka's philosophy of kind of left-wing good governance reforms. And she had a critique recently of some of the Doge things. She had a critique of the Doge buyout that I think was actually perfectly correct, which is basically the Doge buyout was like anti-meritocratic because the Doge buyout financially incentivized people who had the talent to succeed elsewhere to leave. Like, if you're someone who is just like completely useless, you're not actually taking the Doge buyout because you can't get a job anywhere else. So if you lose your job, it's like, it's devastating. But if you're someone with actual talent who could be if anything paid more in the private sector, then of course you're taking the Doge buyout. This is the dream you always needed. And that's the kind of critique of Doge that I think is actually, correct and useful. So I have a lot of respect for Polka. I think that a lot of what she writes is positive. And here is she's less of a political philosopher and more of a technocrat, both literally and kind of philosophically. Like she literally worked in the Obama administration. But anyways, here is what Fukuyama has to say about Jennifer Polka and about kind of left-wing civil service reforms. He basically starts off with the story of the F-16 fighter, of this big, dysfunctional construction project within the DoD. And he basically says, something similar happens when civilian agencies procure software, so basically try to buy and use software. They act if they're buying a big product that will be good for a decade or two. The list of requirements grow into a large, complex contract. Basically, you have ridiculous amounts of piled up requirements and kind of procedural things like NEPA, things that are not actually improving the product at all in any sense. Like that's not what any even proponents of those requirements say, but that are essentially creating like compliance. And then the contractor finally produces the product with little ongoing input, and the software package is delivered after a lot of time has passed. One of the lines that Polka will always say is, this is the waterfall process, right? Everyone is downstream of their superior. Their superiors don't listen to feedback from their subordinates. And so the waterfall process is a commitment not to learn anything. And I think that's true. The problem is technology moves too fast. Companies in the private sector buy large software packages as well, but the process is often very different. Software is introduced in alpha or beta forms where users can interact with it, and only after a feedback period is version 1.0 ready. That version is expected to have bugs and fixes that occur continuously. So this is the agile versus waterfall system that is very well known in software, and which Polka talks about in her book. And here is the core thesis of the argument, I think. The truth of the matter is that implementation is part of policymaking. If a policy cannot be properly implemented, it shouldn't be rolled out in the first place, since it will simply contribute to the narrative of ineffective and incompetent government. So in Polka, and I think indirectly in Fukuyama, you see someone who is very critical and reflective and understanding of the kind of... They're critical of the institution from an internal reformist perspective, right? Literally, in the case of Polka, right? Literally inside the institutions, literally from inside the US government. And their way of framing these inefficiencies as it relates to mediating institutions is really complicated. I'll be honest, I don't actually know, aside from this article, I don't know how much Fukuyama has written on the defense procurement process or software procurement process. I'm more so thinking of Polka when I say it's very complicated and kind of technocratic and, very genuinely helpful in many ways. But what I would say is that Polka looks at it in terms of adding more epicycles. I think in terms of adding more epicycles that probably would be positive in some ways. For example, one of the things that she advocates for is something called SMEQA, S-M-E-Q-A, which is an alternative hiring reform that lets you bypass the what's called the GS scale, the typical payment and hiring scheme for the U.S. government. And SMEQA bypasses that typical hiring scheme for a specific set of expert roles. I asked this to Toto Boyle, who's another kind of abundance Democrat kind of person, when he came on my podcast. Of like, if the rule led you to this, of what use is the rule? Like, why are we trying to have this one narrow edge case, SMICA reform, that lets you hire based on merit in a specific narrow edge case, instead of just saying, like, the GS scale is retarded? Because the GS scale is retarded. And this is, I think, the core difference between Polka and between a lot of the kind of Doge reformist types, is that we just want to nuke the GS scale. The GS scale is fucking ridiculous. We should be paying people more. And we should be able to hire based on merit. And we shouldn't have to go through all this ridiculous compliance when we're hiring people. Ever. Not just for SMICA, but for all employees. And I think the actual reason for this, I say Polka is not really a philosopher, but I think the reason for this is downstream of philosophy. It's downstream of the idea that, you want mediating institutions, you need the mediating institutions, otherwise you'll have something closer to direct democracy, and that's terrible, and, it'll be Elon, and it'll be the oligarchs, and it'll be like the Doge kids running the entire US government. Maybe that last part's true, I don't think it's true right now. I don't think the Doge kids are running the US government, but I think, like, if you truly had, like, the Constitution Curtis would want to write, maybe the Doge kids would be running the U.S. government. Alexander Hamilton would be running the U.S. government. But, the philosophical difference is this idea that the way you solve problems is by adding more epicycles, by adding more mediating institutions, by adding more filters, by putting more things into this pipeline. And maybe that thing, is a rerouting that, saves some time with regards to SMICA. I'm not saying that SMICA reform is, like, a bad idea. Like, it's better than nothing. But it comes from this philosophy of, piling on more and more things into this, like, pile of, like, enormous, ridiculous technical debt. And the reason we preserve this enormous, ridiculous technical debt is precisely, this is my opinion now, not Polka's, obviously, but the reason why we have this enormous pile of technical debt is because we just refuse to admit that, the mediating institutions are actually the problem. Like, you can say there are costs and benefits, but at the very least, you have to admit, for software procurement, the mediating institutions are the problem. They are the singular reason why software procurement sucks. And you can say, and Polka says this and is correct about this, that in her in her book she talks about the completely ridiculous accountability process, where you'll just have these, like, ridiculous congressional hearings where senators harass bureaucrats who are honestly, like, in many cases aren't even doing that bad of a job, every time something bad happens, and it turns into a whole scandal. And you can blame the Senate for ultimately being upstream of all of these intermediating institutions, but I think the intermediating institutions are a problem nonetheless. Like, maybe that ultimate moral blame lies with the Senate, but in terms of the practical problem, it's the intermediating institutions. Any questions before we go on and talk about Ezra Klein? Just gonna sip my tea for a bit. And I have this podcast here. It's actually really worth listening to, the podcast with Fukuyama and the Dispatch people. They're of course like a Never Trump outlet, which I think is basically like, in some ways, even more like, I think Jonah Goldberg is more representative of the Democratic Party than Michel Foucault at this point. I think that's obviously true. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this stream. The whole point I'm making is that, Fukuyama's political theory has become the left-wing political theory. And so, like, you listen to the Dispatch, maybe you would have listened to, like, I don't know, or read the New Yorker or something at this point, but, like, the Never Trump publications, that's where the actual, like, liberal political theory is happening. The Never Trump people, I think they're, like, much more alive than the kind of, like, mainstream left people. And they have, like, actually really good views. Like, we talk about how, like, mainstream media is dying, MSNBC is dying, whatever. The Dispatch, they're doing great, just in terms of numbers. And the podcast itself, I think the podcast itself is worth listening to for the same reason that, all these articles that I just read are worth reading, which is that they describe the liberal political theory. The Dispatch guy, I think it's Jonah, right? The one doing the interview. I don't actually remember. Yeah. So it's an interview between Jonah and Francis Fukuyama. Jonah actually asks about Thymos at some point and the kind of end of history and the last man stuff. He only spends like 5 minutes or something on it, which is really unfortunate to me. I really wish that they talked about that more and how, like, the kind of grand Fukuyama theory of everything, like, interrelates. That's a conversation I really want to hear. We'll see how it goes. Just gonna drink some more tea before we move on to the Ezra Klein section. As always, if you're enjoying the stream, you should share. You should subscribe to the Substack in the link below. You should enjoy. You should drink some tea. Okay, on to Ezra Klein. Ezra Klein has been posting recently. He's been posting on Twitter. He's back on Twitter, amazingly. I think that's a kind of, that's not just a marketing decision, that's like a metaphysical decision, because he's writing about, the thing he's writing about is how, like, Twitter is so important, and he's all in on, like, the Twitter theory of everything, and the attention theory of everything. That's, we're gonna read this article. Should we read? Maybe I should do a poll. Can I do a poll on YouTube? I don't actually know. I know you can do it on Twitch. But we can do a poll of, like, do you want to read the Everything Bagel Liberalism article or the Attention article first? But Ezra Klein's been writing a few interesting things. I actually think, like, the new Ezra Klein is, like, more wrong. Like, just on the facts, just descriptively, more wrong than the old Ezra Klein of, like, Everything Bagel Liberalism, which is an article that I've praised in the past. Or, like, his podcast with Michael Lind, who I've also which I've also praised in the past. I think the like, new Ezra Klein is a little bit worse, but also indicative of the direction that Democrats are going. So to give some context, okay, I've decided, I've decided I don't believe in democracy now. I'm not going to do the poll. I'm just going to read the Everything Bagel Liberalism post first. Or it's a bit of a long article, but I'll, maybe I'll just explain it. But idea behind everything bagel liberalism is that to do even very mundane things within the Democratic Party or within Democratic controlled areas, like, San Francisco, for example, or Washington, D.C., you have to appease all these interest groups. You have to buy off every interest group, and that's what leads to these completely ridiculous engagement letters of something like Queers for Palestine, right? You have the Palestine contingent, you have the LGBTQ contingent, and you also have all of these completely transactional middlemen contingents of of the climate people and of the compliance consultants and of the party itself, of the party apparatus itself is this incredibly rent-seeking creature, in a way that is actually very noticeably different than the Republican Party. And there are just so many middlemen involved in every big Democratic project. You want to do the CHIPS Act, you want to do, the Inflation Reduction Act, you want to build this infrastructure. If you want to build it well, if you want it not to suck, then we can't be having this. We can't be having so many intermediaries and everything. That's the thesis of everything bagel liberalism. And that already sets him, at least a little bit, against Fukuyama. Well, Ezra Klein is a big fan of Jennifer Polka, so I think there's a lot of shared ground there. We just read Fukuyama's description of Polka as, the better alternative, better alternative to Doge. Ezra Klein's a big fan of Polka. In fact, the first time I had heard of Jennifer Polka was on Ezra Klein's podcast. And he's written often about Polka's ideas. And I think he would also fall into that sort of Democrat reformist camp. Now, the interesting tension there is that if you're someone who wants, NEPA reform, energy permitting reform to this bill called NEPA that essentially makes it very hard to build housing, very hard to build energy, including clean energy, right? It makes it harder to build solar panels in all of these ridiculous ways. If you're someone who cares about that, you kind of got what you wanted under Trump. Trump did a federal NEPA reform executive order on day one. Or it might have been day 2. It might have been on the 21st. So, are you cheering? Are you doing your endgame dance? Are you doing, the Trump dance in the endgame if you're an Ezra Klein, energy reform guy? You're actually not. And it's kind of hard to explain why you're not. And part of it is just because, it's Trump. And part of it is because, this is fair. There's more to do in terms of NEPA, right? There's all these state NEPA laws, and there's, the questions about the transmission lines. Ezra Klein has written plenty about this. So it's not like it's all done. But, shouldn't we have, at least a peep from these guys about Donald Trump energy reforms? Some of these reforms, they've explicitly endorsed in the past, but not a peep. Not a peep. Why is that? Well, one reason why that is a kind of trade-off that I think Polka has explicitly written about, Ezra Klein has talked about in the podcast. And this is the idea that, in order to implement things, you need two things, right? You need the ability to actually do it, right? So it can't be illegal. It can't be banned by NEPA or by any of these other, countless environmental laws. But you also need someone who kind of goes through with the process and, helps everyone comply with everything. So you kind of need the competent bureaucrat, basically. That's the big trade-off. And this was what like I said, this was Polka's explicit critique of Doge, which was basically you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're getting rid of the competent bureaucrats. You're maybe disproportionately even getting rid of the competent bureaucrats. And quite frankly, they have a point. In our existing system, as a descriptive reality, if you want to get the energy permits approved, if you want to get the science grants approved, you need the competent bureaucrats. Of course, you return to the philosophical question, and the philosophical question is it good that you need the competent bureaucrat? Like, in a vacuum, if we're taking on this entire political system for granted, then as a descriptive question, yes, it is better to have the competent bureaucrat in the system that requires the competent bureaucrat. That's almost a tautology. But a lot of what Musk is doing, right, is trying to reroute the process so that you don't need any bureaucrats, that you can just build the energy. So let's, with that in mind, with that context in mind, let's read what Ezra Klein is saying about attention, because this is really about politics, right? When we were talking about the intermediating institutions, we talked a lot about the federal bureaucracy. We didn't really talk that much about how the intermediating institutions shape public opinion. Although we did talk about that briefly with the first Fukuyama article. Okay, let's just dive right in. There's nothing new about the problem of money in politics. We've been warned for decades that America is or is becoming an oligarchy. But something felt different about the early days of President Trump's second term, and I think it's this. Attention, not cash, is the form of power that most interests him. Plenty of his billionaire backers didn't make the cut at the inauguration. The catbird seats were occupied instead by the titans of attention. It was the leaders of Facebook and Instagram and X and TikTok and Amazon and Google that Trump was so eager to see arrayed before him. So they're already making this new pivot, right? Klein is making this new pivot because, quite frankly, I just think, like, if it were the case, if it were the descriptive case in reality that, like, all of the billionaires donated to Republicans, then Klein wouldn't be writing this article. He would just blame the billionaires. But that's not the case. Plenty of the billionaires donated to Democrats. Many of the billionaires he listed as the people going to the Trump inauguration donated to Democrats. And their companies massively, overwhelmingly donated to Democrats. But we'll keep going here because this is like the state of exception for Elon. This is why is Elon particularly bad in these people's imaginations? Right? Okay. Let me try to reset and look at this from a more sympathetic perspective. Okay. We at least have some rules to limit money's power in politics and track its movements. The same cannot be said for attention. If Trump saves TikToks and in return TikTok boosts pro-Trump content before the 2026 elections to help it go viral, would that be illegal? Perhaps. What is this link? Just security thing. Okay. But would we even know it happened? If Elon turns the dials to tilt the conversation in the Republican Party's direction before the 2028 elections, who will stop him? Attention, not money, is now the fuel of American politics. It seemed clear in 2022 that Musk overpaid when he bought Twitter for $44 billion. And if it's judged as a business transaction, he probably did overpay. X's revenue is far from justifying its purchase price. But we didn't know then, and we don't know now, how to value the attention he bought. So you're already seeing a very similar theme to the Fukuyama article of Musk's purchase of Twitter. It's not just a financial decision, but it was this huge political sea change. And I think that's true. I think that a lot of people, like Richard Hanania, who is on the right, but a lot of people who are much more right-wing than Richard Hanania as well, they all say that, Musk buying Twitter changed everything. This is one of the things that Ezra Klein and Francis Fukuyama and Curtis Yarvin and Richard Hanania can all agree on. So here, Ezra Klein defines the word oligarchy. Oligarchy isn't mere corruption. It's what happens when wealth becomes intertwined with rulership. Musk is not just seeking contracts or favors. He is seeking influence and centrality. He's offering Trump not just money, but also attention. And Trump has been happy so far to make that trade. So once again, he's kind of strategically defining oligarchy in a way to like exclude democratic oligarchy, right? And this is already accepting the kind of traditional left-wing framework, the kind of far-left framework, that, oligarchy is basically, when rich people are involved in politics. Even that is a huge distinction from the classical definition of oligarchy, shared by, Curtis Yarvin, among others, that oligarchy is when there is a narrow elite class, not necessarily defined through money, not necessarily class in a Marxist framework, but just a small group of people who have a narrow control of power. And what Curtis would say is that, yes, we do live in an oligarchy. He says this constantly. He won't stop saying this. He's said this so many times on my podcast. I think he takes it too far, but okay, let's stay focused here. Curtis says we do live in an oligarchy, but the oligarchs are academia and journalism. They're people like Ezra Klein. So, Curtis Yarvin calls Ezra Klein an oligarch. Ezra Klein calls, Elon Musk an oligarch. Who knows? Maybe they're both right. But he has this analysis of Facebook and about the kind of, tech vibe shift. But there's nothing more. The rest of the article is just repetition. But he's basically saying, Ezra Klein's main point is that, we're seeing this important flow of power towards these social media platforms. And it's very interesting because, right-wingers were saying something very similar in 2020 and 2016. They were basically saying, in 2020, they were basically saying, big tech rigged the election. They were saying, by censoring the Hunter Biden laptop and so on and so forth, and controlling social media, it was the left who was embracing the oligarchy, not the right. And so you once again see this kind of convergence, right? Where, I don't know, I want to see the podcast where we sit down Curtis and we sit down Ezra Klein, maybe in the New York Times building, right? Maybe they met in the New York Times building, who knows? But you sit them down together and say, like, okay, purely descriptively, what do you disagree on? What do you agree on? Klein has a very interesting role here because he talks about the attention oligarchs and he talks about the problem of the social media platforms, but he himself is in the attention business. He writes columns. Like, I give him my attention, right? I'm giving him attention right now. Some of you are probably going to read this column because I linked it and I put it in this video. And so, like, he's in some way an attention oligarch as well. So he is in the kind of same class, really. Curtis Yarvin, interestingly, you ask Curtis Yarvin, who's the most powerful man in America, he will say, the chief attention oligarch. And who in Curtis Yarvin's worldview is the chief attention oligarch? It's A.G. Sulzberger, the owner of the New York Times. So once again, but this is actually an important distinction, because this is something that I think both sides are kind of jealous of the other side for having. Ezra does not like that. Elon bought Twitter. He maybe doesn't talk much about what Twitter was like before. But he would definitely prefer it. But, and Curtis Yarvin really doesn't like that the New York Times is biased towards liberals, or biased towards the left, biased towards Democrats. And, if you really sat down, like, Ezra Klein and Curtis Yarvin, this is an interesting question that I want both of them to answer. Of, like, if you really could trade the New York Times for Twitter, would you? like both of these people, like you have Curtis here. He's complaining about the New York Times. He's saying taking over the New York Times would be the most impactful thing you do. Would you really trade the New York Times for Twitter? Would you rather have had Elon Musk buy the New York Times instead of buying Twitter? Maybe. Maybe Curtis sincerely believes that. Same thing with Ezra Klein. If you really think that Elon is the attention oligarch and it's not A.G. Salzberger, would you trade the New York Times for Twitter? And I actually think Ezra Klein might be. Ezra Klein might be like totally down to trade the New York Times for Twitter. Who knows? Someone should actually ask them these questions. You'd probably... I know. I can try getting Curtis on the podcast again, maybe. Something tells me that Ezra wouldn't be willing to do the podcast. But, I'd love to have him too. The last thing that I want to cover from Ezra Klein is this very interesting interview he did with, I think, someone that he identifies as part of the Abundance Democrat Coalition, Representative Jake Auchincloss. He's a Democrat from, I think, Massachusetts. And Auchincloss is very interesting because he has a kind of Abundance Democrat framework. To clarify, the Abundance Democrats are, this kind of faction of Democrats who are focused on energy reform and housing reform and so on, and making it easier to build things. You can tell that I control-F'd middlemen here. And Auchincloss has this huge... I'm just going to call him Jake. This is too difficult. Jake has this huge criticism of, corporate middlemen. Of what he sees as, pharmacy benefit managers, for example. People who are essentially middlemen, who are go-betweens between insurance companies and hospitals, and are exempt from, like, this anti-kickback law that means that they can basically be legally bribed to give preferential rates to certain providers. And so these middlemen are the main, like, enemy in Jake's mind. So he basically says, okay, here's the thing Democrats should do. Democrats should declare war against these PBMs and all of these other middlemen in energy and healthcare and housing that have made ordinary life so expensive for normal people. Welcome to Maha, Jake. I don't know what else to say. Like, it's a fascinating interview, really, because they're talking about, like, what would be good and ideal and, like, what the Democrats should stand for philosophically. Legislatively, like, in terms of the political coalition, Democrats do not stand for this at all. You looked at the, like, questioning of RFK Jr., the Senate hearing. You get more questions not about what RFK, you get more questions asking RFK Jr. if he's going too far against the corporate middlemen than if he's not going far enough. And so, like, you have all of these people. You have, like, Bernie Sanders, you have Elizabeth Warren, like, defending all of these pharmaceutical companies. It's amazing to watch. We kind of truly live in, like, the Michel Foucault occupied like, Trump HHS but it's really fascinating because, you know, one of the anecdotes that I have is like a while back, Matt Iglesias had this list of principles that, you know, moderate Democrats should adhere to. And I think like David Sachs quote tweeted him and said, you know, Matt Iglesias, welcome to the Republican Party. And I think that this interview, it doesn't really describe where the Democrat Party is, but describes where the Democrats aren't. Because they're talking about this, and, you know, maybe, I think, like, Jake, you know, sincerely believes this, and, you know, would vote in favor of this. Like, he himself would vote in favor of this. But his Democratic colleagues won't. And so you're describing this ideal that is just completely detached from the reality of what the Democratic Party is and what it's becoming and its trajectory and its sincerely held beliefs, both in its elites and in its voting base. Like, I raised this interview to say, like, oh, the kind of shining beacon of Democrat Party reform that Ezra Klein is highlighting is someone who, for all intents and purposes, would be interpreted by the median voter as a Republican. And maybe that's a good idea, right? Maybe you want to reform the Democratic Party and become more moderate and adopt and agree on some of the Republican proposals that are actually good from their perspective. That's one direction, right? That's one direction of reform, is the kind of Bill Clinton triangulation. That's one way you could do it. But in terms of like what the liberal political theory actually is, I don't think that'll happen. And if anything, right, we just read the Fukuyama articles praising, you know, executive agencies, you know, quote unquote independent agencies, right, all the mediating institutions. I think it becomes very difficult to say that like the private sector PBM is categorically different than the public sector equivalent of the PBM. Which is exactly the Democratic Party constituency now. Which is exactly the new political theory, as articulated by Francis Fukuyama. This is one reason, ultimately, why I think the abundance Democrats will fail. I talked about this in my podcast with John Askinis as well a few weeks ago. You're watching on YouTube as well. You'll be able to find that on YouTube. Just go to the channel. But, like, the abundance Democrats can't even kick the AI doomers out of their coalition. The abundance Democrats, they have a completely neurotic and unconfident and agreeable vision of political economy. They are not equipped at all to fight the middlemen. Now, maybe, you know, people like Jake can gain more power and can gain like official power and maybe sway someone like Chuck Schumer onto his side who is really good at politics, or, you know, Nancy Pelosi, and they can lead the kind of abundance Democrat revolution, maybe. But that's a wild scenario. That's already contingent on like so many things happening. The most likely thing that happens is that all of these like agreeable abundance Democrat think tankers, they write their policy papers, but when push comes to shove, when it comes to actually coalitional politics and making sure your allies have power and your enemies do not have power within the coalition, that they will just fail. That they will fail to attack. Like, they should just come out and say, like, the Sunrise Movement is evil. That, like, NIMBYs are evil. That, like, all of these, like, you know, there's a kind of schism between the kind of Democrats who want to build infinity solar panels and the Democrats who like NEPA. The environmentalists who like NEPA are evil. Like, Ezra Klein should just come out and say that. They should be ostracized from the party, that they should lose social sanction, that they should be canceled. Basically. At least maybe not canceled from, like, you know, random, like, apolitical jobs, but, like, forcibly removed from the Democratic coalition. And they can't do that. They're just like... I personally know a lot of abundance Democrats. They are maybe my favorite genre of Democrats, my favorite flavor of Democrat, my favorite genre, my favorite faction of Democrats. I know many of them personally, and they don't have the personality to engage in that type of politics. They just don't. They're not capable of doing it. In some ways, I think that's like, you know, that's a selection effect. Like, if you were that person, you'd be in the Republican Party. You'd be fighting for NEPA reform as a part of the Republican Party. Those are the people who won, by the way, who got the NEPA reform done. At least a larger part of it than the Democrats did. And so, like, you know, Abundance Democrats, many of them are good people, but they have, like, a fundamentally broken metaphysics in which they're, like, not willing to admit that some people are just evil and need to be stripped of all political power, and that is the only way that change within the coalition happens. I think a lot of other factions of the Democrats, by the way, are willing to do that. The socialists certainly are. The NIMBYs certainly are. Like the eco terrorists. They kind of are eco terrorists, but the kind of like anti-abundance Democrats are. The kind of like degrowth communists are. Those people are willing to actually have sharp elbows. and so, you know, good luck to Ezra. I think Ezra, as a kind of commentator, as a kind of intellectual, is very talented. I think that he had, like, prior to, or maybe shortly after the Trump win, prior to the kind of Trump taking office, he had, like, Michael Lind, and it seemed like he was going more in this direction. Matt Iglesias had this, like, post attacking what are called the groups, like, you know, they call them the groups. The groups, they're in. They stop us from building. They're NIMBYs. They're blocking the housing. You know, the reform, the permitting. It's a morass. It's a morass. You have to file all these permittings, and the lawyers, they make millions of dollars. And the housing is just the worst. But in all seriousness, I think that moment has kind of come and gone. Because ultimately, the Democratic Party energy right now is in favor of the middlemen. It's in favor of the mediating institutions. It is fundamentally going against Ezra Klein's previous political theory of kind of abundance Democrats and going towards much closer to the Fukuyama direction that we've already discussed. All right, my throat is really beginning to hurt. We might go over this article next time. Great article by John Askiness. This is not related to the liberal political theory, not related to the present liberal political theory, but I had this queued up to explain why Foucault is now right-coded. But that, I think, will wait for another time. Because my throat is really starting to hurt, and I've really enjoyed the stream so far. I hope you have enjoyed this stream so far. If you did, please subscribe to the channel. Please let a friend know, either in person or online. It's a great way to help. You're not just helping us, you're helping them find something interesting and informative. And yeah, share the stream. You can also find the Substack below. You'll be able to subscribe for free for some free articles, as well as a paid subscription if you want to support my writing, podcast, and streams financially. I'd greatly appreciate it. And thank you for watching. Bye.